Okay, let's do this. Hi everyone, my name is G Pineda. This is just the intro slide. I have my own slides I brought, so I'm gonna go ahead and transition into those ones. Um, but my name is G Pineda and I use they, she, he pronouns. Today I'm here to present my research, which was my capstone project I submitted for university honors graduation, in addition to the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship. My faculty mentors, Dr. Brandon Andrew Robinson and Dr. Setsu Shigematsu have significantly helped me in designing and conducting this research, so I'd like to give them a special thank you. The title of my project was Let's Talk About hashtag Trans Lives Matter, a critical intervention on the digital resistance to the violence against Black trans women. So first I'll introduce the background into my project. However, before I do so, using the Zoom chat feature for my audience, can you please type in into the chat any hashtags you have seen or have personally used in the past, please? I'm interested. I'm interested to see what hashtags y'all have used. It could be anything. Okay. So as these continue coming in, I want to thank y'all for participating. I'm going to have a couple of these interactive things. But as shown here, hashtags are used in many online interactions by many people, especially during an era where hashtags create and are themselves social movements offline. The background of this project pays homage to various hashtag social movements of the past decade, from Janet Mock coining hashtag girls like us to Alicia Garza, Patrice Colors, and Opal Tamidi using hashtag Black Lives Matter. We can see that these hashtags have made such a large impact onto our society. We can even look more recent times, such as the BLM resurgency arising from the outrage of the murder of George Floyd in 2020. This historic event ignited a global response to the violence against Black communities. For instance, in LA, over 30,000 people marched down Hollywood Boulevard in support of the All Black Lives Matter march. This was a movement and a hashtag that highlighted multiple intersections of Black identities, such as Black LGBTQ people. This event holds a significance in my project, as on the same exact street where this march occurred and where you see the letters on the screen, less than 2 months later, three trans women of color by the names of Jocelyn Busent, Eden Estrada, and Jocelyn Aylen were publicly attacked and humiliated by a group of cisgender men of color. This assault was live streamed and posted onto Instagram, initially by one of the perpetrators. As the incident received mass attention from multiple journalists and organizations and celebrities, information began to transcend multiple online platforms discussing the attack, most notably YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. As I begin to think about my project as it relates to this incident, I want to now focus on the purpose of my project. So my research question in this project was asking this: how have social media audiences conceptualized social justice for the trans community in light of transphobic violence within the year of 2020? My project sought to explore how hashtag activism, or the creation and proliferation of online activism stamped with the hashtag, addresses but also influences violence. Previous literature on one side has claimed that hashtag activism or slacktivism hurts social movements by being performative, less valid, and in competition with direct to face-to-face action. On the flip side, there are recent scholars arguing online activism has a far-reaching influence, moving debates about violence from the margins to the center, which provides material gain in crucial spaces. A good example is the defunding of police departments and the rise of online conversations and on-the-ground activism from the BLM movement. Moving beyond the project's purpose, I'm interested to know this. Using the heart emoji, either in the chat or the reaction, please indicate if you've ever used Twitter before, or if you're familiar what a Twitter thread is. Now, for those non-Twitter users, it's okay. You're still valid, and I'm still here to actually explain to you what these things are. So a Twitter thread is like a linked conversation, usually about one topic or subject that is started by an initial tweet. Now you may be asking, why is this important? Well, this was important because it was the unit of analysis that I focused on in my project, specifically threads that were discussing the West Hollywood attack. I used threads to provide a holistic depiction of online conversations and examine the dominant discourses on Twitter. By using Twitter's advanced search feature, I limited my search to a 5-day time frame following the attack, for I wanted to ensure the relevancy to the incident. Additionally, I did this by choosing the words Eden the doll, hashtag trans lives matter, and hashtag black trans lives matter. In terms of my methods, my content analysis archived the tweets within the threads so I could conduct a close reading. From there, I surveyed the sample threads through a self-constructed code book in order to operationalize them. My code book consisted of 8 separate coding indicators. So the first 2 ones asked about tones and intent. So in the basis of informative versus uninformative, basically, were they in support of the survivors? Were they in support of the Trans Lives Matter movement? And also in the messaging, was it trying to convey a certain emotion, or was it trying to just relay information about the attack? Then the next 2 discussed the carceral state, which I would define as the logics, ideologies, practices, and structures favoring and depending on criminalization tactics, punitive punishments, such as incarceration. The next 2 coding indicators focused on multimedia
Thank
to
you.
see if there are specific media attachments, if they were present, and if so, what kind were they? Then went into identity categories, meaning if there was any identity categories talked about outside of race, outside of transness, such as race, in addition to what names were being mentioned within the tweets. So now that I've explained my methods, I'm going to go over the data that I gathered. Altogether, I was able to collect a final sample of 17 threads. The online impression for these threads equaled to more than 70,000 retweets and more than 100,000 likes. Altogether, all the replies on these threads were over 1,000. So altogether, the data I was looking at, the final number of tweets within these threads was 702. From there, this is just a brief overview into what I found on these tweets. Most of them were in support of the Trans Lives Matter movement, and most of them were just trying to convey an emotion. This was expected since, I think most people would feel a certain way about seeing this type of violence onto these women. But going into the last section, the last 3, I found that most of these tweets did not have multimedia attachments. They did not have any mentions of other identity categories but transness, and that there was no mentions of carceral state, or there was, not that much. However, now what I'm going to go into is in these last 3, while there was not much, I'm going to go into the realities and the depictions of what they did look like when they did exist on these threads. And so these next 3 finding sections I'm going to provide for y'all is kind of just the analysis that my paper looked at. And so speaking of multimedia attachments, I found that a lot of the media that was being projected was violence. It was the reposting of the live stream. Um, and so this particular one's actually a screenshot from Eden the Dolls, one of the survivors' Instagram, where she took screenshots and screen recordings of the live stream and posted on her own account. And we can see that either some of the sites are explicitly naming and calling out the perpetrators, but then there's actual ones where you can see someone like visibly hurt and lying on the ground, and another one where you can see where someone's physically and like, it looks like really hard they're throwing this scooter. And so I found that this was occurring a lot. Specifically, I found that out of all of the multimedia being shared, over 65% of the media was photos of the attack and about 14% videos of the attack. Um, and how I make my own intervention is that I am in the firm belief that the visibility of violence reproduces these systems of domination through symbolic violence. Now you can be like, well, gee, what is symbolic violence? Well, how I would describe it is as the non-physical violence that sustains these dominant structures and that ultimately reproduce power relations. I'm gonna break this down, right? So if a trans person is seeing this violence being occurred on another trans person, that might reinforce the transphobia in our society. Dr. Laurel Westbrook coins this term called the vulnerable subjecthood, which is the unintended consequence in portraying vulnerability to violence as central to identifying as transgender. So trans people are being are in fear that this one day might happen to them. And I insert in my project that this, I call it viral vulnerable subjecthood, as the TLM threads were oftenly projecting this, and oftenly a lot of these responses were rooted in fear. Now going into carceral logics, which is kind of like criminalization rhetoric. On the left-hand side, this is actually another screenshot pulled from Eden's story, where she's asking people to find the names of the people, her attackers, and report them to LAPD. And so some of the other responses I include on the screen are the direct responses to Eden's call to action. We find specific language of like, put them in jail, let them rot, because of their bad actions. While I agree that there were bad actions that were created, I also have to understand that they are also symptoms of these larger systems that we live in. That transphobia is not just from communities of color, like how they're portraying, but actually it is rooted a lot further than this. And so putting somebody in jail isn't going to alleviate us from transphobia. In fact, it's probably going to perpetuate it more. And so in the tweets, I was surprised to find that the majority of the times when the carceral state was talked about, about 75% of the time, they were complicit, and they were perpetuating these carceral logics, or how I define, you can see on the screen, as this punitive principle of social space and crisis ideology, both within social policy and the state within itself, that prioritizes criminal punishment. So it's, again, the lock them up and put them in jail kind of vibe, right? And so I insert into my project that these ultimate carceral logics are limiting the trans liberation movement. And while though, mainstream anti-violence advocacy is often equated imprisonment with justice, we have the tools to look at it differently. Dr. Dean Spade theorized this term called the critical trans politics, which challenge these notions of incarceration, and basically says, well, we can't influence our movement into the assimilation of its existing systems of domination, because that ain't liberatory. And so I say that we need radical politics to be further implemented into mainstream usages of hashtag activism. Now, in terms of race and how race was talked about, this is actually a threat. So I know it's kind of complicated, but work with me. In the middle was the initial thread, right? And so because this initial thread had said the quote, 3 Black trans women, when Eden is not a Black trans person, um, race became a site of contestation. And so there were some of the wide ranges of responses that were occurring on these threads. On the top left-hand corner, I saw that oftenly people were just saying Eden and not mentioning Jocelyn and Jocelyn's name. And then on the bottom left-hand corner, Black on Black crime discourse was really put into the threads. Also, colorblind racism existed. A good example is the top right-hand corner, of people saying, race doesn't really matter. However, there were intersectional conversations, abysmal, probably non-existent. But there were a few, and a good right on the bottom right-hand corner is a good example of how intersectionality was discussed. And so altogether, I found that although Eden was more oftenly mentioned than the other survivors, Jocelyn and Jocelyn, in this instant, when race was discussed on these threads, they were ultimately inadequately discussing intersectional aspects of the West Hollywood incident. Instead, they were projecting this racist ideologies of Black on Black crime discourse and colorblind racism. Trans scholars by the name of Dr. C. Riley Norton and Dr. Jen Hawthorne have theorized this term called murderous inclusion, which is basically means the immobilization of poor trans people of color in their subalternate lives, yet their sudden inclusion in mainstream agendas, which, breaking it down, it's like basically trans people of color only matter when they are dead, and we are not going to take care of them while they're alive. And I theorize that this same term can be applied to the TLM threads in the ways we talked about Black transness within around this attack. And so we need to move away from these liberal foundations as they reinforce oppressive structures of anti-Blackness and transphobia. So as I go into my conclusion, why should we care about this? One, trans people of color are more likely to experience violence. Two, these same people are severely impacted by these oppressive institutions like the criminal punishment system. And three, that the queer and trans liberation movement is inherently tied to racial and economic justice. The limitations of my work is this. Social media does provide spaces and communities for queer trans people of color. And however, though, I am in the firm belief that hashtag activism cannot solely address these issues without on the ground activism. How can we move forward? Well, we should move away from identity politics and focus on radical politics. We need to head towards a critical intersectional standpoint that adopts multi-community coalitional politics. Why is this important? We're all subjugated under the same system, regardless of sexual and gender identity. Our experiences are connected with other communities, and I leave off with this. Remember, fight the power, not the people. I have provided a QR code if you would like to read more into my project. Pull out your digital, your little cellular device, scan it, please, and feel free to read my work. If you have any questions about today's presentation or would like to know more, please feel free to contact me on my social media or via email. I would like to thank my mom. I would like to thank my brothers. I would like to thank my friends and family who have supported me in the last 2 years. I would like to thank my faculty mentors, the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, and University Honors for funding this research. Also, shout out to Dr. Marquise Bay and Dr. TJ Bullard from Northwestern University for helping me put this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, G. That was a very interesting presentation. We have time for one question for G. Like I said, I want to make sure we get to all of our presenters. Does anybody have a question? Suddenly all the emojis stop.
I have a question.
Yes,
Great
Megan.
job, G. I had a quick question. How do you plan to expand your work in the future?
Oh my gosh, thank you for this question. So I am actually studying abroad in this upcoming year. I'm going to Italy in the summer, DC in the fall, and I'm going to Paris next winter. And I would like to continue making my project not just a US-based project, but a transnational project. I want to be able to share my work with those that are not familiar with trans politics. In addition to come fall 2022, Ms. Sang is applying to PhD programs, and I would like to expand my work because there were some limitations I had being an undergrad in this work, but I know I can continue furthering it. But yeah, I know I only had room for one question, but I wanted to thank all of my friends and my family for coming today. It means the world to me that you took the time out of your schedule to be here. Thank you so much.
And we will have more time at the end for questions. But I want to make sure everybody gets a chance. So, but thank you again. But yes, there will be more time at the end. So if you have additional questions for G, write them down so that we can ask them at the end. Our next presenter is Monique. Hold on. I keep losing your guys' intros. Monique is a transfer student in her final year at UCR. For the past 2 years, she's worked in the lab of aging and neurocognitive imaging. She plans to continue with imaging research in the future. And Monique's presentation today is basal ganglia network contributions to associative and skill learning. Oh, and G, you're still recording. It's okay, I forgot to remind you too.